Welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Reynolds and I'm on the board of Sutherland Shire Environment Centre. Welcome and thank you everyone for coming along tonight and for your interest in wildlife crossings, including those that we could potentially have around Sutherland Shire and potentially collecting our national parks. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Dharawal people, who have cared and continue to care for country. We recognise that Aboriginal sovereignty has never been ceded, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm just going to give a short introduction about the Centre's interest in the idea of wildlife crossings before I introduce our speakers. The issue has been a concern for some years. One of our long-standing members, Bob Crombie, is a former Royal National Park Ranger. Bob has previously written about wildlife crossings and a potential overpass at Koalas Bridge south of Waterfall over the F6. So I'll just show you that location now. Okay. So drawing on Bob's work, in 2020, I wrote a new report on locations around the Shire where koalas were being killed or injured on our roads. The report was co-signed by a number of other groups and submitted to Sutherland and Wollongong councils, hoping that both would advocate for measures to protect our local koala population. So you can see here the numbers around the Shire, and unfortunately many of those little red triangles on the road indicate koalas that have been killed there. Just a couple of years ago, many people still didn't realise that we have so many koalas around the Shire. The areas we were particularly interested in the report was up here at Sandy Point, around this zone here and down along the F6. Now, we know that a whole range of native animals are being killed and injured on roads here, and Ross will discuss this in more detail shortly. But koalas are an iconic species and people get very upset when they're killed, understandably. The number of koalas killed on Heathcote Road around Sandy Point drew media attention. This is a selection of just a few articles. We've since found out that koalas are also being seen and also being hit by cars around the F6 freeway. This just hasn't been publicised so well as yet. Sutherland Council and Wollongong councils have both since passed motions to start developing koala management plans, which is terrific. And thank you to Sutherland Shire Councillor Deirdre Steinwell, who's here tonight, I think, for your advocacy on this. The initial report was also co-signed by a number of other groups. Their support and their advocacy was critical to our path towards achieving more positive outcomes. We had the support of Friends of the Royal National Park and Oatley Flora and Fauna Conservation Society. The National Parks Association Southern Sydney branch co-signed the report and also arranged a meeting with our current Environment Minister, James Griffin, when he was still Matt Keane's Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment. His intervention led to the New South Wales Koala Strategy team getting involved, and from there, Transport New South Wales. Transport New South Wales commissioned a report into the Deadmans Creek kill zone at Sandy Point, and we're hoping that they will release that report shortly and progress action on it. We've been given positive indications this will occur, but there's been no formal announcement as yet. Sharon Cullis is not here tonight. She's from the Georges River Environmental Alliance. That's her in the photo here, fourth from the left. She deserves recognition for her advocacy, her long-term advocacy, including the work she's done with Saul Dean from the Total Environment Centre and Save Sydney Koalas for the Campbelltown population up here, which you can see is much larger than our Sutherland Shire population. We also had the support of Sandy Point Residents Association and the Woronora Valley Residents Association. So together, all the groups, put in another submission with recommendations, mitigation measures for the Heathcote Road bridge widening project. That's the bridge over the Woronora River around that location. So it's been fantastic that there's been such a drawing together of groups focused on achieving better outcomes. And there's still a lot more that can be done. The F6 is a concern. And I know that the National Parks and Wildlife Service have been flagging this in reports for years now. Tonight, we're delighted to have Associate Professor Ross Goldingay here to outline his research. Ross has just completed one of the most detailed surveys of the use of underpasses by Australian wildlife that has been completed to date, that has been published to date. He's been conducting research into road barriers and their mitigation for over 20 years, and made the case in a scientific paper 10 years ago for the road and rail barriers between the Royal and Heathcote National Parks to be addressed. He's also the editor of the peer-reviewed scientific journal Australian Mammalogy. I think I've pronounced that wrong incorrectly, Ross. You'll have to correct me on that later. Josie Stokes, who was our other speaker, has unfortunately been called away. She's doing microbat field surveys in some remote mining area in South Australia and has only intermittent wireless access. But we have the wonderful Jackie Marlowe from the Northern Beaches, who has agreed to step in. And Jackie's insights will be invaluable. She's played a significant role in advocating for the new overpasses and underpasses between Ku-ring-gai and Garigal National Parks along Monable Road. And that's also long-term advocacy that she's carried out for over 15 years. Jackie has travelled internationally researching roadkill mitigation measures. She belongs to multiple scientific research groups such as Ecological Australia and the Royal Zoological Society, is the Northern Beaches Raptor Coordinator, and has been actively involved in organising multiple national conferences for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Centre. So just one last point from me now. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll know, and the recording will be made available in the next few days. We've also allowed time for questions at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or you can raise your hand at the end of the meeting. Kay Osborne, our project officer, will be moderating and fielding questions as well. Okay, so with that, I will hand over to Ross.
Sorry, just had to unmute myself. So I assume you can see my screen here. Don't want to be talking to a blank screen. Okay, thanks for that, Catherine. Just, sorry, I've just got to, I should have put on a bigger screen. I'm sort of running out of bit of space here. Anyway, that's better now. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to cover in this talk, I've prepared this slide. So I'm going to start off by just giving you a bit of my background. I'll then talk about Royal National Park as a habitat island. That's how I tend to see it. I'll outline some work that's been done on wildlife road crossing structures recently. Just keep in mind that I'm going to, some of this stuff I'm going to have to just skate over because there isn't enough time to really go into it in detail, but some of it I will go into in a little bit more detail. Then I'll talk about some of the koala records from the Bionet Atlas that have accumulated over the last 20 years for the Royal area and also the areas to the west of Royal, and then I'll reach a few conclusions. Okay, let's see if I can advance these slides. Okay, so my background to this talk is that I grew up in Sydney, actually grew up around Revesby. So in my teenage years, I spent time hiking in Royal National Park and also camping. So it was sort of our go-to place for recreation a lot of the time. And at the time of the bushfires, I was actually living down at Wombara. And then within a few weeks of those fires, I was up spotlighting with Debbie Andrew and also Rob Whelan. And at that time, we were trying to see whether we could detect greater gliders and a few other arterials, because we were a bit concerned about, you know, what might have occurred after the fire or during the fire, because the fire basically burnt through 95% of the park. And it was about that time or after that that I started scratching around in Royal looking for broad-headed snakes, and then that turned into a more formal study, which surprisingly, maybe to me, I guess, it has extended for 25 years, and I did the last sort of formal survey back in 2020. I've also had a long-standing interest in eastern pygmy possums, and I've done some detailed work in Royal over the last 15 years with some students and some other research assistants. And I've also been studying wildlife road crossing structures over about the last 20 years. So that provides reasonable background for this talk tonight, I think. Now, probably everyone in the audience is familiar with what Royal looks like in terms of its geographic layout, but I thought I'd put this Google Earth image just to sort of set the scene and also to highlight a couple of things, which is that the obviously the park has a coastal border on the east side. The northern side, to a large extent, it's got the Hacking estuary, but it's also got a lot of residential development around it. But then on the western side and down to the southwest, you've got this border that's made up of the Southern Freeway. And it's not just the Southern Freeway. In places, there's also the Princes Highway, and there's also the Illawarra Railway that runs through there. And then as you go further south, you sort of run into the urban development around Helensburgh. So when I look at it, I tend to look at Royal and see that it's basically an island, that it's not those linear infrastructure won't cause a barrier to all species, but there are some species that will see that as a barrier. Animals can behave in different ways. Some animals won't venture out into those sort of open spaces associated with roads, whereas others will venture out and then they might just be easy sort of roadkill victims. Whereas there will be, of course, other species like many birds that can simply just fly over the top. So, you know, the species that and how they deal with these sort of new features can vary. Let me just flip to the next slide. So anyway, I guess the other key point to highlight here is that there's all this bushland to the west of Royal. So, you know, to prevent some species losses in Royal, we really need to ensure that that Royal is connected up to those western areas and that the intervening roads and railway lines are not causing complete barriers for many species. Now, just to sort of zoom in on some of the development on this western side, just to give you a flavour of it. So around Heathcote, it looks like this. There's quite a lot of residential development. As we move a bit further south, the residential development sort of narrows and you're just sort of left with the road itself. Now, what this actually looks like when we zoom in on it, if you look on the left-hand image there, basically we've got the Southern Freeway on the left and then the railway on the right. So the two together basically create a habitat disjunction of about 68 metres, which is quite considerable. As we move further south, these two pieces of infrastructure sort of separate somewhat, which may be useful because some species might find larger distances more difficult to get over. Whereas when they're sort of split up with some vegetation in the middle, they may be able to use that vegetation in the middle as a bit of a stepping stone. So it may make it a bit easier, but nonetheless, you know, there's still a fairly major freeway there with a lot of traffic on it that they need to negotiate. And particularly of interest is that as we move further south, the Princes Highway actually cuts under the Southern Freeway. So this could actually form a place where some species can actually navigate the freeway and pass underneath. But at this point in time, there's been no changes made to that landscape feature to make it more suitable for fauna. So there are things that could be done to try and perhaps encourage species to move under that underpass that otherwise might be blocked by the freeway itself. Now, what is evidence that the freeway might be forming a barrier to species within the park? Martin Schultz actually did a fairly detailed report for the Environment Department back in 2011. And Martin also did some fairly comprehensive surveys through Royal and some of the surrounding areas at that point in time. But he also collated a lot of the historic records. And what that showed was that there is a reasonable number of species that have been missing for many decades. So among the mammals, there's these species here, the platypus that we've heard about recently. some small macropods like the potteroo, the paddymmelon and the palmer wallaby, but also water rats and spotted-tailed quolls. And then there's other species like a couple of frogs and also a few species of bird. Now, we might debate whether these species have completely gone from the park. There might occasionally be records of these species appearing, but the key point is that these species have declined in abundance so that they haven't been seen for some time. And if you go out and do surveys, you're probably not going to find them. So, that it's quite likely that they are actually locally extinct within the park. So one of the key lessons we know from the theory of island biogeography is that when areas of habitat become isolated, they don't necessarily lose species overnight, but over time, they won't be able to contain all of the species that they held originally. So you will lose species. And keep in mind that the road barrier has really only been in place for about 45 years. The Southern Freeway was completed in 1975. So that's not really all that long. So it's quite likely we're going to see additional extinctions if Royal is isolated from those areas to the west. What other evidence is there? Well, there's been studies conducted overseas of fairly large conservation reserves where there is some long-term data, and the typical scenario is that they just can't hold all of the species that they start with, that they will lose some over time. There's also been quite a few population and genetic studies conducted in Australia that show that populations that become isolated end up suffering from various forms of dysfunction. And including there's been some genetic studies done on squirrel gliders and koalas that demonstrate that roads can actually cause genetic subdivision in populations. Now, we're not just completely relying on these, this other sort of information. I've collected samples from broad-headed snakes and eastern pygmy possums in Royal, and I've coordinated the collection of samples in areas to the west so that we can try and see if there's any genetic evidence of isolation in those two species. But these are only just two of many species in the park. So, it may not tell us much, but I'll be surprised if it doesn't reveal something. Okay, which species are most at risk? Well, as I said earlier, flying species can, fly over those road areas. So it's unlikely that they're going to be barriers, but it's also likely that there are small birds that prefer to sort of live in dense habitats, that even though they can fly, they may still encounter barriers from roads. But the main species we'd be thinking about would be ground-dwelling species that have low dispersal ability, and also ones that are susceptible to roadkill. So you might think about frogs on wet nights, that they often hop out onto roads. A lot of them end up getting squashed on the road because they'll sit on the road for too long and just don't have that sense where they'll get out of the way when a car comes racing along. We'd also be concerned about rare species. When we can use the koala as an example here. But I guess with the koala, it's also has some other characteristics too, in that it is somewhat slow moving, and because it's of a reasonable size, it's one that cars quite readily bowl over, because an animal like that moving across the road, it's a fairly big target even when you're trying to avoid hitting it. The other species we'd be concerned about are the gliding species, so mammals that require tree cover to move across a landscape. Now, we can focus in briefly on the greater glider, because this is one that highlights some of these characteristics. But there was concern about the greater glider after the 94 fires, as I suggested earlier, and there were surveys done. So we did surveys, there were other people that did surveys, and none were actually seen until 2012. So they went missing for some time. It's not to mean that there weren't pockets of animals somewhere in the park, but clearly they'd been reduced in number by the fire, if not perhaps driven to local extinction. We don't know. But they have the characteristics which would suggest that they're going to be vulnerable, that they're up in the tree canopy in hollows and so on, and also they're very slow breeding. So if their numbers are reduced, it can take some time for them to build back up to the numbers that they were at. This species is now federally listed, so we should be focusing in on it and maybe doing some systematic surveys in Royal to see whether, what sort of numbers it might occur in. I don't think there's been any surveys done since 2012, any detailed surveys. Now, part of what I'm advocating here is that we need to think about putting in road crossing structures to allow animals to safely cross over the Southern Freeway. There's basically 5 different types that we can use, and the New South Wales Road Agency has actually been installing these structures since the mid-90s. So they've been road bridges, which are basically sort of a very expensive structure for a range of different species. On the right-hand side there, we've got glide poles, which are designed for gliding species. The lower left, we've got rope canopy bridges, which are designed for both non-gliding and gliding arboreal mammals. And then on the lower right, we've got the underpasses, which can cater to a very large range of different species. Now, are these structures effective? People have probably heard about whether these structures are working or not, and whether they work for certain species. And maybe you've heard mixed messages. In terms of the way I'm going to view this, I'm not going to get caught up in debates about how we might define effective. Scientists will define this in various ways, but I'm just going to present some data on use, which is basically just photographic records of animals crossing using these structures. You've probably also heard that there is some concern about whether predators might target these structures, because if we're sort of encouraging animals to move through a sort of a narrow space, they might become, easy victims to predators that might sit in wait for them. But let's look at the evidence that's available currently. So there has been quite a bit of work done by myself, postgrad Brendan Taylor, as well as some researchers from the Uni of Melbourne, Kylie Soanes and Rod Bandery, into how effective glide poles are for getting gliders across the road. And Brendan and I have actually been fairly active in trying to get some of our different trials published so that the evidence is actually out there as to whether these structures are working or not. The lower left there shows some structures I had Brisbane City Council install. The upper one on the left is a single pole on the Pacific Highway up near Grafton, whereas the lower right is a pair of poles. There were 2 pairs of poles installed on the Oxley Highway at Port Macquarie, and I was involved with advising the road agency before those went in, and then we did a 3-year study to see how well they worked. And we did get lots and lots of records of feather-tail gliders and sugar gliders and squirrel gliders, but one of the key things for our study was to get the first ever records of yellow-bellied gliders on those poles. And Brendan and David Rawita have also detected yellow-bellied gliders several times on that pole down at south of Grafton. A study in Victoria where poles are put in along a power line easement have also detected greater gliders on poles. So basically all of the gliding species have now been detected using poles. And there are issues around the spacing of poles and the height of poles to make them friendly to the gliders themselves, in terms of not pushing these animals beyond their gliding capability. So some of the work Brendan and I have done has actually been directed at trying to describe the gliding capability so that we can get the trigonometry right when we're installing these poles. Now, if we move on to underpasses, there's been a hell of a lot of underpasses installed on the Pacific Highway as part of the duplication project. Lots of monitoring has occurred by consultants, but very little of that work has been published. Consultants, there's really no incentive for them to publish the work that they've done. But because I was heavily involved with one project and Brendan Taylor and David Rawita were involved with another project, we've been able to bring these together, and this study that combines these two is currently in review with an overseas journal. So it basically encompasses 7 underpasses on the Pacific Motorway up near Grafton, and also 5 underpasses on the Oxley Highway, on that part of the highway that extends from the Pacific Highway into Port Macquarie. And our camera monitoring extended over 2 to 3 years. And one of the unique features of our study was that we also selected random sites in the forest to put cameras at, so that we had some sense of the relative activity of the different species in the forest. For example, if we find that koalas are not using our underpasses, is that because they don't like underpasses, or is it because they're basically just not very common in the surrounding forest? So that's a really important aspect of any of these sort of studies. This is what the underpasses look like. They varied a bit in design in terms of shape and size and length. Some of them had timber railings running through. That was an early idea to try and make these things more attractive to koalas, but koalas don't really seem to care whether there's timber railings or not. The designs are somewhat varied, and we didn't really have a lot of replication, so we can't really answer any questions about whether one design works better than another. But the images on the left show some of the underpasses at Port Macquarie and the positioning of our cameras. And then on the right, you can see one of our forest cameras, which is basically just pointing into a space in the forest, so we could record animals that were moving past the camera and then relate that to what we had moving past the cameras in the forest, in the underpasses. We detected a range of different species, and in the analysis that I'm going to show, I've just focused in on the more frequently detected species, but there were a few other species that I'm not going to refer to, various reptiles that you get a few records here and there of, but the camera monitoring is not really designed to pick up reptiles. Here's some of the images from the random forest sites. Now, without getting too carried away with the analysis, I'm going to present a series of graphs, and in each of those graphs, on the left-hand side, you've got the underpasses. On the right-hand side of that graph, you've got what we detected in the forest, and basically just look at the height of the bars. So the higher they are, the more detections, and the more frequently those species use the underpasses or the forest sites. So I'm sort of contrasting individual underpasses as well as the underpasses with the forest sites. And there was a few different patterns that we saw. Basically, some species like the swamp wallaby were using the underpasses really readily. And they also were detected fairly frequently at the forest sites as well, whereas some species like the eastern grey kangaroo on the right just favoured one or two of the underpasses. And equally, you might get them just occasionally, or you might get them using one of the forest sites quite frequently. Or in the case of the eastern grey kangaroo, it's a grassland species, so it basically isn't detected very frequently in the forest. It's basically finding a pathway through the edge of the forest and then coming through to underpass number 2, and then just moving through that. And then when it got to the other side, it's basically heading off into a grassland area where we didn't have our cameras. Species like the redneck pattymel, so it's showing that sort of pattern too, where there was one or two underpasses that were favoured. It was found fairly frequently in the forest, but at a couple of the forest sites more than at the others. Something like the echidna, one underpass that was detected reasonably frequently in one of the forest sites. Something like the lace monitor that was detected at both locations, it was detected much more frequently in the underpasses than in the forest. And this applied at both Grafton and Port Macquarie. And basically what we're seeing, the analysis that I'm showing in these graphs is really only looking at presence absence on a weekly basis. But basically with something like the lace monitors, there was a number of individuals that were going through the underpasses in the morning in one direction, and then in the afternoon they're coming back in the other direction. So they're using them to sort of expand the area available to them for foraging. Now, did the underpasses operate as prey traps? So if they did, we'd expect to see more frequent activity by the predators at the underpasses. So in terms of the dingo or dog, we just didn't see that. They were detected very infrequently in the underpasses at Port Macquarie. At Grafton, again, they were relatively infrequently were they detected. In terms of the feral cat, there was only something like 2 records at Port Macquarie and a few more records at Grafton, but generally they were detected at a very low frequency at all the sites. Something like the red fox was detected more frequently in the underpasses, particularly at Port Macquarie. So there was a couple of underpasses there that it was detected at quite frequently. But if you're thinking about, okay, does this indicate that they're targeting prey, then you would expect that they're targeting the underpasses where their potential prey are going to show perhaps higher activity. And this wasn't the case. The paddy melons were more using underpass 1 more frequently. And I also looked at 2 species of bandicoot that occurred in the same area. Another thing I did in the analysis was to look at the sort of timing of the records. And I did this in a way where I looked at whether they occurred on the same day or not. And generally there was very little association between whether the foxes were using the underpasses on the same day or night, that is, as the potential prey. And it could be that the potential prey were basically avoiding those times. So they may be able to pick up on the scent of the foxes and just avoid using those underpasses when the scent trails are fairly strong. So, you know, that may be operating, but it didn't sort of suggest that there was any strong evidence of prey targeting. Now, at both sites, we only got a few records of koalas. So something else that we've been doing over the last couple of years is doing some more targeted underpass surveys in an area where we know there are koalas. So a road called Skyline Road, just to the south of Lismore, back in 2008, part of it was still unsealed, and the Lismore City Council completed sealing that road. But at the time when they were planning for that, they realised that there were quite a few koalas in the area, so they developed a fairly comprehensive plan. So they put up exclusion fencing and then installed 6 underpasses. And at the time, they had Steve Phillips do some various monitoring using sand tracking of those underpasses. But more recently, we've used the wildlife cameras to assess those underpasses. And this is what we found over the last 2.5 years, that we're getting fairly frequent traverses of koalas of the 6 underpasses, some of them more so than others, but particularly during the breeding period, which is extending from sort of September through to December. So, you know, it's providing strong evidence that koalas don't show any sort of avoidance of using underpasses. And the middle image here actually shows a koala up to its ankles and wrists in water that was flowing through that underpass. Now, if we move back to Royal, there are some prospects for already modifying some of the existing structures, like I already said. Catherine highlighted the Koala Creek Road overpass. So an overpass that was put in at the time, I assume, of the when the Southern Freeway was constructed. There was some sort of management road going through there, but nothing has really changed. So that could be turned into a wildlife land bridge. On the right, these aerial images on the right show land bridges within the Brisbane City Council area. So the top one is a fully vegetated one. The lower one is one that actually has a management road over it, or track, and it's partly vegetated. So, okay, some conclusions from this. Road crossing structures do work. There's weak support that predators actually target prey that might be using the structures. Koalas will use underpasses. Existing structures around Royal could be modified, but I think we need more structures. But discussions about how many we might need, where to locate them, could come in later. Now, just to move on to the Bionet Atlas records of koalas, here I've just downloaded the records from a 20-year period leading up to June 2020. I cut it off at June 2020 because there were some of the officers for the Department of Environment started radio tracking koalas in Heathcote National Park. So a lot of additional records were added as a consequence of that. And I just wanted to highlight the sort of, probably more of the records that were put in by just members of the community. The circled ones are the roadkill records. So you can see they're sort of fairly widely scattered across some of the major roads, including the F6. But I think it highlights in my mind that further to the west, where we've got the Campbelltown population, that basically animals are dispersing out of that population, moving broadly across the landscape and trying to make their way over into Royal National Park, and they're being thwarted to some extent. But I think, you know, because there is a lot of concern around the Campbelltown koala population, if we want to really secure that population, then we want to make sure that koalas can move fairly freely through this whole landscape. Because even if you've only got a small number of animals in Royal and Heathcote, it adds to the total number, so it provides a greater buffer against this population, disappearing over time. And I guess I'm also using koalas to highlight the point that for a lot of species, we can't see what's going on. We can't see the dysfunction that's created by these roads. Whereas with koalas, because they're much more visible and they're iconic and people like to report them, we've got evidence here of what's going on across this landscape. But we just, there are probably similar things happening for a lot of other species, but we just can't see it because we can't see where the animals are and people are not reporting when they do see them, or they're not reporting them as often as they do for koalas. And just to highlight that underpasses will cater for other species. We've encountered very large eastern brown snakes in those koala underpasses up at Lismore. So, clearly you can get snakes. So you could get broad-headed passing through underpasses. Now, some final conclusions here. Loss of connectivity is a very serious concern. We really need to think long-term. So we need to think about trying to make sure that Royal National Park is connected to those areas to the west. I predict there will be further losses in Royal if we don't do that. There are many proven solutions already. Don't think that, we're still trying to identify how to mitigate those road barriers. We've got the sort of tools at hand. So I think we should just get on and do it. Okay, thank you, Catherine.
Thanks so much for that, Ross. That was terrific. It's occurred to me while you're talking, we always boast about the Royal National Park being one of Australia's favourite national parks, best loved national parks, most important national parks. So it is really important to protect it. But we've also got a few questions. If we could hold off till the end after Jackie's talk. Jackie, if I could hand over to you now, if that's okay with everyone. Yeah. Jackie, you're on mute, I think.
Mute, okay. So all I need now is just to be able to drive the screen. So share screen. Here we go. Okay, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, sorry about, I realised my computer played up tonight because I had so many things open. So that's why it wouldn't work. Anyway, okay, starting off, I live in the northern beaches of Sydney, and I've just got to get this to, sorry, might be a tick, it's being difficult in a minute. Okay, should go to the next slide. So this is the northern beaches of Sydney. You can see that the northern beaches of Sydney has got a lot of built up areas, Palm Beach, Avalon, Newport, all the way down to Manly. And we still have a lot of bushland left in Ku-ring-gai National Park. And then this is Garrigal National Park through here. It goes on both sides of this road, goes down here. There is a lot of unmarked bushland that is not protected at the moment. It's owned by the Aboriginal Land Council and a lot of private owners. And then we really have a sort of an edge all the way down to the harbour, which is sort of the foreshores, which is part of the bushland in the area. Okay, we're very blessed in the northern beaches. We have a lot of threatened fauna. We have lots of powerful owls, barking owls, sooty owls, etc. We have at least 4 species of microbats. We have grey-headed flying foxes. We have a lot of raptors, including the osprey. So we're really, really lucky with what we've got. We also have common species like ringtail possums and wallabies, swamp wallabies particularly. We don't have any of the rednecks that Ross was talking about. We don't have wombats. We did have a population of koalas at Avalon, but it has long since gone extinct. But we still did have platypus not so long ago. This is just one of the posters we put together. We've even got endangered red-crowned toadlets, giant burrowing frogs. We did have southern brown bandicoots. We've got eastern pygmy possums. So we really are very blessed. In fact, the former planning minister used to call it God's country. Okay, now Greater Sydney has accepted that we are really important, and they've designed what they've called the green grid. and they're trying to basically develop the area carefully so that we don't lose too much bushland. You can see here's Garigal National Park, here's Coringo, oh, sorry, that was not supposed to happen, is Coringo National Park, and through here, through French's Forest, we've got Manly Dam. And we're trying to keep this connectivity, although this has already been broken because they've built a new hospital. Basically, green areas are really important for humans as much as for animals and threatened species. Okay, so through our paradise, though, unfortunately, we have got some major arterial roads running to the city. So this is the Wakers Parkway. It runs from Narrabeen through to the French's Forest Hospital and through to Seaforth. And as you can see, this side and this side is very green all the way down here, and down here is very green. But there are also arterial roads that cut through the bushland. So this is Oxford Falls Road, this is Morgan Road, and this is the Forest Way. We also have Monable Road, which goes from Monable all the way to St Ives. And then we have McCar's Creek Road, which runs through the National Park. So you can see that it's really important we get our connectivity, because Dan Ramp, in about 5 years ago, got a paper published, and he showed that the greatest concentration of wallabies was found here, then down here. So the wallabies are trying to cross across here. And we do tend to see that we get a lot more threatened species up here than here than here. And as I said, that north-south connectivity, because of the new French's Forest Hospital, is broken. And so the Manly Dam is now isolated. We started monitoring in 2005 because it was not unusual to have 5 dead wallabies on the parkway at any one day. And we've set up a couple of websites that monitor what's happening, that people can enter. It's just open to anyone. Basically, you can see that where the roads exist by the roadkill. So this is Monable Road going over to St Ives, and a lot of these would be wallabies. We've also got Forest Way, which you can see also has a huge wallaby roadkill. And as for the parkway, it's a disaster. And then you can see secondary roads also have roadkill as well. So this is one of the secondary roads. This is Cicada Glen. It has a huge wallaby, possum, echidna roadkill all the way along it. So we got really cross about this situation. So 2005, we started up a group called the Northern Beaches Roadkill Prevention Committee, and we've done everything that you guys did. I was pleased to see you were using stuffed koalas like us. I don't know if you've actually made your members dress up in koala suits and stand on the side of the road with wobble boards, but we certainly did. And we kept hassling our local members, including the ones who are actually on the committee. We got petitions signed. I think we got nearly 10,000 people in our petition to upgrade for the upgrade of Monable Road to put in mitigation. We actually convinced the RMS, which is what its name was then, to put out these signs, and we kept them moving because everyone knows that everyone ignores static signs. And we even got the RMS to write an advice on reduction options of roadkill. And Josie, who should have been giving this talk, was one of the people who actually wrote that document. We also found that if you really want people to come and listen to what you're talking about, that live animals work. Well, we're not allowed to use mammals under our Sydney Wildlife Charter, but we are allowed to use reptiles. So we've got the obligatory lizard here. And if you're trying to attract people to hear what you've got to say, if you can get kids in, you can get the adults in. Anyway, we kept publishing our data, kept giving papers, and anyway, RMS came to the party and they said, give us 6 months worth of data and we'll see what we can do. So in 2007, we got our first exclusion fence built on Wakers Parkway. So on one side, you've got a cliff, which animals can't get down easily. And on this side, which is next to a creek, you've got this exclusion fence that stops animals coming through. At each end of the exclusion fence, we've got a creek passing under the road, so we've got natural underpasses. And we put in sand traps to see what was happening there. We did try cameras, but we have a lot of problems with mountain bike riders and motorbike riders, so cameras weren't very viable. So this is what's happened since 2007 to 2012. So that's the first fence there, that one there, both sides of the road basically, except where the cliff is, in 2007. And virtually there has been very, very little roadkill on that road. The only time we've had roadkill is where like an ambulance had to cut through the fence when someone's crashed. Then in 2012, we got this section that goes through what are called the bends on the Wakers Parkway. And 2019, we got some more fencing, just a small amount. In 2019 through, they built the new hospital here, and we complained and whinged and carried on. So they actually gave us exclusion fencing all the way down to this creek on both sides of the road and on the other side of the road. So we're slowly getting there. It's just taking a long time. We do have a lot of underpasses that are not fenced, which would be good for control experiments. So we've got these creeks coming across. And so we've got bridges here as well, and very large pipes that are tall enough that you can walk through. And just going back to what Ross said, we found that this underpass here, we were getting foxes. We did have a camera on that, and we were getting foxes through it, but I don't think it made any difference because we haven't noticed any decrease in the wallaby roadkill around here. We also got some possum overpasses put in by Transport when they put the new fence around the parkway, so we've got 4 of those. Anyway, one of the problems with fences that Ross and I were discussing the other day is maintenance, and it's a really big issue. So if you are lucky enough to get your fences put in, and I've been watching them along the Pacific Highway, you also have to make sure that you maintain them and you keep on top of the maintenance. So this is where we had the flood the other day that went through Wakers Parkway. You can see it's taken out the fence. They took out probably half a kilometre, if not more, of fencing. It just pushed it flat. This is where we've had a car go through the fence, and I basically have become very adept at putting up temporary barriers until the contractors can come and fix it. It's amazing what you can do with this orange flashing and cable ties. You can certainly stop things. We also insisted on the Wakers Parkway that they put in gates because of the bushfire risk, and I've seen some horrific pictures from up around Coonabarabran of a whole lot of kangaroos basically burnt to death where they couldn't get through a fence. So we have gates, but then you have humans who like to leave the gates open. So I have taken now to every time I go up and down the parkway carrying a packet of cable ties and tying the gate shut each time I find it open, which is very rare regularly. So if you're going to put in fences and underpasses with exclusion fencing, you need to have a maintenance plan and you need to keep the contractors on it. Okay, we also did our petition, which we took to the local member of almost 10,000 signatures, which we were getting at those when we were having those displays. And the reason was that there was unfortunately a terrible accident on Monable Road, and 2 men were incinerated by a big petrol tanker. So the government found money to upgrade Monable Road. So at the moment, they are upgrading this green section, which is called Monable Road East Upgrade. And then in the future, they're going to do from the top of Powderworks Road right through to Terry Hills, which is called Monable Road West. Where the green line runs, we've got fencing on both sides of the road, and we have got 2 dedicated animal underpasses and a dedicated overpass. And this blue one is when they eventually get the money for this is the overpass that Catherine showed. This is proposed to be $20 million. This is being built at the moment. It's a $5 million overpass. It will be vegetated, and the purpose of it is to connect Coringo National Park with Ingleside Chase, which doesn't show on this picture, but it's a green section that runs north through here. And in here is Katandra bushland as well. And this big overpass, this vegetated overpass, will connect Coringo National Park with Garrigal National Park. So we still have the problem of the bottom end of Garrigal National Park connecting with the bush on the other side of the Wakers Parkway. So this is a picture of our $5 million overpass. They've built this bit. Whoops, sorry, go back to that. So they've built this bit here, and they're still in the process of building this bit. The other thing I will say about overpasses and underpasses is they don't necessarily build them where you want them built. They have to have the geology right to be able to do them. We actually wanted our overpass built right down where all this stuff was, because that was a logical place to have it, because there were all the cliffs on either side. But they couldn't land, as they said, the actual structure, so they had to move it further up. Consequently, they took out a massive amount of bushland in the process, which it's good and it's bad. I mean, we certainly aren't going to have the roadkill that we used to have on the Monable Road, which, you know, as I said, you could have 3 or 4 wallabies in one day, or all sorts of other things, snakes, threaten lizards and stuff. But you do lose a lot of bushland in the process when you have an upgrade. I actually would like personally just for them to take existing roads and to actually just add mitigation to them. But again, you still got to be careful about where you put your fences and which species you're going to affect. Okay, so Transport New South Wales and OEH are in agreement. They agree they have to avoid and minimise impacts. They have to mitigate impacts where avoidance is not possible, and they have to offset where these impacts can't be avoided. But the thing is, we need to hold them to these, because they do tend to skate around and ignore us unless we create a really big fuss. And it's a long-going process, and every person who is watching this is invaluable, because we all have different skills. Our groups had people who are media people, we've had PhDs, we've had OEH members, all sorts of people involved. So there's everybody. It really is a case of, if you want to make change, you just got to keep fighting and keep fighting for a long time. And as Jane Goodall says, you just cannot give up. You don't give up. You just keep going and keep going. And I hear from a friend of mine who actually went and did some work with her that she drinks whiskey and she swears, but she doesn't give up. Well, I swear, but I don't drink whiskey, and I'm not giving up, and I'm keeping going until we get our northern beaches protected for its connectivity. So thank you.
Jackie, thank you so much. It's, from my perspective, it's incredibly valuable to get hear what you have to say about what you went through to get through the crossings over there, and the way the community got involved as well. I might just hand over to Kay Osborne, our project officer, if I can. We've had a number of people type questions in the Q&A, and I think Kay is going to read those out. So Kay, I'll just hand over to you if I can.
Sure, thanks very much, Catherine. So there are 2 ways to ask questions. You can type them in the Q&A box. Please don't put them in the chat, because we will become very confused. And the other way is to raise your hand, which I see some people have done already. So we'll go to the Q&A box first, and I'd just like to start with Alana's. Alana Street asked a great question. Something I heard was that koalas won't use wildlife corridors if they smell another koala has crossed it. Is there any merit to this? Ross or Jackie, would you like to answer that one?
I don't know about the answer to that. I mean, all I can say is from our monitoring up at Skyline Road, we were getting multiple individuals in those different underpasses. I mean, this question is one that comes up in relation to a lot of different species, because we're, you know, if species are territorial, you know, what happens? Do they allow other individuals to pass through? And my feeling is, like, this comes up particularly in relation to gliders. And I think when sub-adult animals are dispersing, they will just move through. They will try and avoid adult individuals. So I think they will just, you know, run the gauntlet if there is an issue. So I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case, that they're going to avoid sites where they can smell other koalas.
I'd agree with that. I mean, as a Sydney wildlife person, I'm studying a lot of ringtail possums and brushtail possums in care. And I think they're more likely just to come out fighting if they need to get through to get a resource. They don't sit back. So they certainly just go through and get where they need to be.
Thanks, Jackie. A couple of people have actually asked about the cost of fencing and overpasses and underpasses. Both Stacey and Patricia have asked great questions. And Stacey asked, what about the fencing? Is that a cost that can be justified with the evidence? And what about maintenance of the fencing? Patricia's question is relative costs of overpasses and underpasses.
Okay, I might try and pick that one up because I'm probably able to answer that more. Overpasses are very expensive. It depends how they're built. I don't think Ross has been going to the ICOAT conferences, but they're trying in America to work out a way of doing prefab overpasses where they can actually just bring in a crane and put them in place. But as I said, you've always got the problem of where you're going to land it on either side and the geomorphology of the rocks. So that's a big issue. So overpasses are definitely super expensive. Underpasses are less expensive, and underpasses often can be modified, as Ross will agree, because they have to put in underpasses to control water flow, and you can actually do a cutout section within an underpass so the water can go through and the animals can pass down the sides. Fencing is quite expensive, but at the moment there's this big push for this virtual fencing, which is more expensive per kilometre and still lets animals get killed. Proper fencing, if it's maintained and has gates and things that allow animals to cross in the events of stochastic things like bushfires or floods, it's quite reasonable per kilometre, but it depends. I mean, I know that Ross will probably be able to answer more about the Pacific Highway. They have seriously big budgets. I think they get their money from the fuel excise, and they will spend millions and millions and millions of dollars. Fencing in the scheme of those $1 million is a very small amount. So Ross, do you want to add anything to that?
I could add some old costings, because I think Patsy wants some hard numbers. If we go back 10 years ago, I think land bridges were costing of the order of maybe 5 million, whereas underpasses, those prefab very large underpasses, maybe $500,000. I was involved with some early discussions of the Pacific Highway sort of duplication between Wardell and Ballina, where there was the main issue was koalas there. So there were debates or discussions about the long story, but the road agency had actually agreed to put in several land bridges, and because, as Jackie suggested, because of the sort of topography, those land bridges were going to cost $12 to $15 million each because of the earthworks and so on that were required. And what ended up coming out of that is when you drive up there now, there's no actual land bridges, because all the experts in the meetings agreed that it would be better to get some sort of bridge type structures underneath. So when you go up there, you'll find that the road, what do they call it, like the roadway is actually lifted up. So you've got a much bigger area underneath where koalas and other wildlife can pass through. It's not just under the underpasses. There are underpasses in places, but the the decking has actually been lifted up. So they did that instead of the land bridges because it was going to be cheaper. But it's sort of, you're still talking big numbers. And as Jackie said, the fencing, which I guess is not as much as the structures themselves, but it can add up fairly quickly. Something like poles. I mean, I used to think when poles was first started to go in, we did the poles were my idea, and I had a student that did a project where she basically just organised the poles herself. And at that point in time, back in in 2005, they were costing about a couple of thousand each, whereas I was involved with another project 5 years ago in Brisbane, and because they had trouble sourcing the poles, it ended up costing $60,000 for something like 6 or 7 poles, and they had to pay for transport costs and all sorts of traffic control as well. Anyway, like that can be expensive, but the poles themselves should be cheaper than the canopy bridges. But yeah, those structures will be a fraction of the other structures.
Can I just add one other thing? All of our fencing initially on the parkway was done on the wing and a prayer, so you can actually cut down costs. Our first lot of fencing cost $70,000 on the Wakers Parkway, and then we got a grant for $19,000, and then I think it was $70,000 for the second section. So we're talking in thousands of dollars, but you have to look far and wide to get a contractor who will do it. But it is doable. And the main reason it worked on the parkway is because we've got natural underpasses. So all we really had to pay for was just fencing. But I'm sure if you're looking for like local roads where you want to protect your koalas, if you can find the underpasses and you can put in effective fencing, it can be done relatively cheaply.
Can I just check with you both? I've seen the fencing. Can you guys hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
The fencing with the Compton Road project, that's got, I think, the floppy top,
Yep.
and the bottom has a panel so animals can't sort of climb over.
Yep.
I saw that that's not the fencing you have, Jackie. Do you have any?
No,
Ross?
we don't have a koala problem in the northern beaches, although we have had a koala killed on one of the arterial roads in 2001, and we actually have had a live koala sighting last year, again on that same road. So it could be a real problem if we don't do something. The floppy top's useful if you've got koalas, and if you haven't got koalas and it's mainly wallabies and possums and stuff like that, we just do a straight top on ours. But I think Ross and I would agree that if you go anywhere into koala territory, they definitely put tin or something that stops the koalas getting across the top, because it's a big issue, because they definitely can get onto the road and you can't get them out of the road easily. So if they get into the roadway, then they're a real menace to people trying to avoid them, and you like to have people having head-ons. So they really should not be allowed to get into the road area.
Thanks, Jackie and Ross, for that. We've got Pat Derman here has had her hand up for some time. And remember, we've got a fantastic number of questions coming into the Q&A. You can also put your hand up. So I'll just see if Pat's there and can ask her question.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Pat.
I just think it's fantastic that you're having such a lot of success. We're faced now with losing our koalas because they could be becoming overcrowded. The corridor's been cut heads except for a small area along the river. And we've been trying for 6 years to get overpasses or underpasses on Appin Road. We've done all the normal things, court cases, petitions, begging letters. We've had support from all over the world. And I just want to help. I mean, has anybody got any ideas when everything else has failed, other than keep fighting, which we are? Has anybody got any suggestions? I mean, you know.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat. Would Jackie or Ross like to respond to that?
Jackie might be the best one to answer that one.
Well, I'm a bit naughty, actually. I've worked out that you actually can make exclusion fencing quite cheaply. The trouble is who owns the road edge. If it's within the RMS, like the RMS or the roads, Transport New South Wales owns basically from the white line on the edge of the road, basically about 3 metres in. And then beyond that, there's another landowner, depending on whoever it is. I would be inclined to find if you've got any underpasses there. And if you have, I'd be inclined to just use star pickets and chicken wire and make your own floppy top fencing on, not on the RMS land because they'll pull it down. But if you can get away with it on the private land behind, I'd start fencing the road because it is not that expensive. When I said I've travelled the road, I've travelled the world looking at roadkill. I've travelled Australia looking at roadkill and ways to stop animals getting places. And down on Kangaroo Island, I saw a very effective way of keeping kangaroos out of someone's garden, just with chicken wire, star pickets and a floppy top. And it would not have cost a lot of money. And, you know, like if you got something like a company like Bunnings on the back of you, you probably could get the equipment for very little cost indeed. But you've just got to be careful about the law, that's all.
But Jackie, didn't you also make yourself a bit of a pest to, you know, some of the politicians to get their attention and get them to do something? So that might be more of the answer, the solution,
Yeah. Well,
rather than going out at night and putting up fencing.
We had the local member on board in our initial committee, which really did help. We went and we got all the politicians. So we had the local member, the local mayor, the administrator for the council, OEH, Sydney Wildlife, Wires, a whole lot of groups involved. And apparently for the Compton Road overpass, apparently, and I heard this from Thomas Creevy, who was one of the instigators of that, whenever they had a wallaby killed, they used to pick it up and they'd wait till there was a council meeting and they'd throw it into the middle of the floor on the council meeting. And apparently that was what gave them an attraction to get their overpass. So I think you have to be a really polite but squeaky wheel.
Right, I love that vision, Jackie. So we might move on to the next question. And Bruce Straw has asked a number of questions. Thanks so much for your engagement, Bruce. We might just take one of the questions at this point, which is the same question asked by Gary Shua, which is about sprinkler systems for crossings. And Bruce asks, could we look at having sprinkler systems at each side of the crossings, if not along the whole crossing, so that when we have our next fires, the crossings could create safe havens for native species that can outrun the fires?
I'll pass to Ross.
I think that might sound good. I think it might be a bit tricky. I think Jackie's idea where you've got some gates that you can just sort of throw open, but with your gates, Jackie, I mean, who's going to go and throw them open when there's a fire? Is it up to you? Like what's the chain of command?
That's a good question. We still haven't exactly found out who is responsible for doing that. For me, I can actually, because I'm close to both Monable Road and the Parkway, and it's an urban area and they're not super long, I probably could get them all open in the event of a bushfire. But, you know, when you're talking about seriously long roads like the Pacific Highway, I don't know who does it.
Yeah, it's interesting because Gary Shaw has actually asked if anyone knows if the RFS or State Rail opens the safety fencing during fires for both the firefighters' safety and animal escape for fires.
Yep. It's a good question.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Clearly something that needs to be built into sort of future consideration, that what to do when there is a mega fire.
Yeah. We've got another question here from Georgia, who's asking, can I ask Ross if he was involved in the Ballina bypass, where Ballina Koalas, Maria Metes negotiated for 27 underpasses under M1? Georgia's just done an interview with her.
What was the last part of that, Kay?
Oh, sorry.
Someone did an interview with her.
Yeah, so Georgia's recently filmed an interview with Maria from
Maria. Yeah, I know Maria. Well, the answer is that. So I think the area that she's talking about is that area, what they called, I think they called it Section 12, which extended from Wardell to Ballina on the M1, the Pacific Motorway. So it was, well, to be honest, I think it's a long story. I won't go into all the details, but the road agency had a particular route that they wanted that road to take. So there was some agitation from some local groups, possibly Maria, or perhaps definitely Maria and others, to try and have that route reconsidered, because it was going right through the middle. It wasn't actually going. It went through a little bit of koala habitat, but essentially it was going through the middle of areas where the koalas were on each side of the road. So it was a lot of it was actually going through sugarcane areas, and it looked like it sort of made sense, but at the same time it was potentially going to create a barrier. And I think early on they hadn't really put in enough structures. So with the agitation of Maria and others like Steve Phillips, they then were forced into that situation where they had to reconsider, and that's when they brought in the New South Wales chief scientist then brought in a committee to look at that. So I did attend some of those meetings early on. And as I said, there was this discussion among the experts and among the engineers about, what was the best way, that you could have X number of land bridges, or you could have 2 times X number of these other underpass type structures.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. The next question is from Mel Keith, who's asked, what role does suitable habitat play in dispersing arboreal mammals? For example, would a greater glider pass through an unsuitable habitat such as heath in order to get from A to B?
Animals, when they're really pushed, will sometimes move through those areas, but you've got to keep in mind, like, some of these gliding species have been found on the ground, but generally they're going to be very vulnerable to predators on the ground because they don't move as quickly. But in terms of unsuitable habitat, like, there's been a few genetic studies done where people have been surprised to find out that in areas where there's a lot of pine forest and highly fragmented eucalypt forest, that greater gliders in those areas are not showing genetic subdivision, that basically there's gene flow. And what it shows is that if you've got structures like, or structures, you've got trees like pine trees that got greater gliders not going to feed in, they can still use them as structures to move through. And we've seen similar things with yellow-bellied gliders too. So, that's what gives rise to this idea that you can just stick up, dead poles to get animals to cross over areas. But generally, you don't want to rely on animals having to move through, say, heathland if it's a forest species. And this is what is shown by some of the genetic work, that where you do have these canopy gaps, you get much reduced gene flow when the canopy gaps are beyond their gliding ability. So we're talking about, 50 metres or 60 metres, that populations each side of those sort of gaps are often showing restricted gene flow.
Great, thank you, Ross. There's a few comments in the chat. Thanks so much. So Anne's clarified that opening gates during a bushfire should be part of the agency's state rail, ARTC, etc. bushfire management plan. It's a good point. And Andrew Douglas says he's happy to work up a concept plan for crossing Appin Road. Yeah, which is
I just asked question,
yeah,
Kate. I thought that, I don't know Appin Road at all, but I thought the RMS actually was working on koala mitigation on the Appin Road. Can somebody enlighten me, please?
We've had promises that they will fence. They're talking about a corridor down in Appin, but that would have to go through houses, a roundabout, a greyhound track, a paintball facility, and a motocross club. At Mount Gilead, this is what we've been fighting for 5 or 6 years. There's been a lot of talk, but no action. They say they're fence. Lendlease say they'll put up a concrete wall, but animals are still getting killed. As I said before, we've lost the corridor already at Ayards, except for a small area at the back. So there's been a lot of talk and a lot of fight, and we've had a lot of people help us, but no action on behalf of the government, and they won't even talk to us. So, yeah. So, yeah.
Thanks, Pat.
Okay.
We've got a couple of questions about virtual fencing. Could you just perhaps Ross or Jackie explain again what is virtual fencing? Vanessa has asked this one.
A virtual fence is where you might have little posts on the side of the road, and they're activated in some way. They might generate light or sound. So if animals are coming along to cross the road, they trigger a sensor, and then these things start making light or noise. They're a little bit controversial in that there was a study done in Tasmania, but it wasn't very well replicated, and it seemed like it did actually reduce roadkill. But I think there has been some other studies. I think there was one in Europe somewhere that did a fairly detailed study with a virtual fence and found there was no benefit of the virtual fence.
And it's expensive.
It's probably cheaper than structures, Jackie.
From
Well,
what
I don't know.
Within Australia, no, it isn't. They're just normal exclusion fencing is cheaper. But it is one of the latest hot topics, so everybody's sort of jumping on it. So Josie's the expert on it. She's done some work in Tasmania on it, but she's not here.
Thanks. So we've got 10 minutes left, and the questions are rolling in. Can we go to Georgia just to ask her question live, because I don't think I got the gist of it before.
Sorry, hi. Thanks, Kay. Yeah, no, we've just been up to Baggetville and seen the flooding, and that was all devastating. And I just want to put in a plug for Maria Mathis, because she's working on the ground with the koalas, saving a lot and taking them up to Lismore, Friends of the Koala, and very dedicated. She had a kind of, we went there for the good news story of the success of her negotiations with RMS and the different stakeholders. And, you know, she's regarded as a bit of a hero. And I was particularly interested for Pat and Save Sydney Koalas, you know, that Lend-Lease actually constructed those underpasses. And Lend-Lease are the ones in Appin Road saying they can't construct too, because they're the ones paying the cost. And as you say, Ross, the government or someone else paid the cost for the M1, the Pacific Highway. But what we found talking to her was that the koala colonies were smashed anyway, and that the building of the road resulted in gates being left open, koalas getting caught between fencing, and actually really controversially, not ring barking, but collaring of trees that were koala trees by the construction crew, construction workers. So by the end, she had koalas that were stressed sitting looking at road trains 50 metres from their tree. And she had stressed sick koalas with chlamydia, and the colonies that were being preserved, so-called, declined. So she's of the view that the road should have been moved, you know, and that the underpasses were not enough, although she has conceded that they might accommodate future animals crossing the landscape and, you know, some kilometres away.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Jackie and Ross, would you like to comment on any of that?
I don't know enough about the Pacific Highway to comment. It's Ross's area.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of which part of that to talk about. I think it was a bit of a tricky area because, as I said, the road was actually going through mostly an area of non-habitat. And I think the road agency initially thought that was a good solution because it was going to avoid the koalas, but there was clearly an issue with you know, subdividing the local population. And I know of stories of what was happening during construction. Brendan Taylor and David Rawita were involved as consultants with that project. I don't know the details of it, but I think, you know, it's one of those things where koalas end up doing things that you don't anticipate. So I think there was a lot of, you know, they were learning new things as things went on. And koalas did commonly sort of end up in the construction area, even though they did have it fenced off quite extensively. And they did have sort of responses for that. And I think the only thing I would say, having seen a lot of different projects, and people can often, you know, present the worst case scenario of, you know, when they don't know all the details, is that, and I certainly don't know all the details, and I'm not trying to present a best case scenario, but I think with that project, because of the nature of it, I think it's going to take time to really get a sense of whether it's been successful or not. And the main reason for that is that the underpasses were really there to facilitate dispersal across the landscape. This is one of the interesting things with some of these structures, that when they go up, and when you start seeing a lot of use, you're seeing animals that may have incorporated both sides of a road within their home ranges, whereas to a certain extent, the underpasses are really intended for dispersal movements, which are very, occasional, infrequent movements. So that particular area there with that road, that's what might have been more likely to happen, rather than to see animals moving backward and forward like we're seeing at Skyline Road, because clearly at Skyline Road, the animals are using habitat on both sides of the road. So all I'd conclude from that is I want to see the data that come out of it. I don't know, if that's going to happen, because, as I say, consultants often don't, write up publications from the work that gets done. And I haven't spoken to Maria in the last couple of years, so I don't know her side of the story. So it may be a little bit bleak, perhaps, but I suspect that because some of the habitat was going to be lost, and they were doing a lot of replanting, and there was some offsetting happening, that it could take a bit of time to really see the benefit of what happened.
Thanks, Ross. And thanks for that, Georgia. We've got 5 minutes left, and we'd like to get through as many questions as we can. So the next one, Tasia Kolesnika has asked a question. What species are next in line for local extinction from the Royal National Park if road crossings are not adequately installed?
That's a very good question. Well, 20 odd years ago, I would have said the broad-headed snake, but having done surveys over 20 years, I'm very confident that the broad-headed snake is going to be there in the next 20 or 30 years, because I was seeing a lot of habitat disturbance early on, and now with the surveys I've done, they're fairly hard to find, but there is a much bigger population there than what I would have thought. Okay, what other species can I think of? Well, as I said, I mean, the greater glider, we're not sure what's going on there. There really hasn't been the surveys done. I'm just racking my brain and thinking about some frogs and other things. I mean, generally, it's going to be some of the mammals. Okay, the one that I think is probably the next one is going to be the wombat. And people may not realise that there are common wombats in Royal National Park. So when I've been out doing surveys for broad-headed snakes, I'm doing a lot of bush bashing and going over various areas, and I find, the fecal pellets of wombats, and it can't be a very big population. There's just a few areas where I see their scats, so it can't be very big, and it's quite isolated. I guess they are over sort of Picton Way, but they must be quite isolated, because it is another species like the koala that is quite vulnerable when it tries to cross roads. So that would be my pick. I don't like to, name a top 10 or top 1 or whatever, but I think that might be the one to be concerned about, because it has a fairly small, I assume, a very small population size.
Thanks, Ross. The next question is also for you. It's from Vanessa Wilson, and she's written quite a bit of information about her own honours thesis. But she's asking, has your research looked much at how to reduce deaths of vertebrate classes other than mammals? For example, by planting appropriate roadside vegetation, or is it mainly about connectivity for terrestrial species? Because she noticed frequent killing of bird species on roads.
We've actually done a lot of work earlier on frogs. So up at Lennox Head, so there's a coastal road there that cuts through some coastal heath, and Brendan and I did surveys there over one summer, and I'm trying to think what the numbers were, the estimates. So the key species there were the Wallam sedge frog and the Wallam froglet. So two state listed. Well, the sedge frog is actually federally listed, whereas the other one's only state listed. The estimates were, I counted on the road, so we did like 12 nights, and there were hundreds of both of these species, as well as other frogs, dead on the road over a summer, and my estimate was something like 15,000 individuals of each species were being killed annually. And the problem with frogs, so we did a little bit of other work at Brunswick Heads to try and see how you might deal with this. The thing with frogs is it's a bit like koalas. You need a metal barrier, and that barrier needs to have like a curvature at the top so the tree frogs can't actually climb over it. And most of the fencing we've been talking about is chain wire fencing that the frogs just go straight through. In terms of the birds, there are issues. Like I've driven through Royal. Martin Schultz and Kylie Madden did a roadkill survey. They picked up, and this is over a few months, something like 83 dead eastern pygmy possums on the road. And that was on the road, Sir Bertrand Stevens as well as Bundina Drive. They were living out at Bundina at the time. My recent work on pygmy possums, I collated some data recently, and I found that even though I had some nest box grids that straddled Main Bar Road over 4 years out of 150 possums that were tagged, there was only 2 that actually crossed the road, which just surprised me. But in terms of birds will be killed. I see a lot of honey eaters dead on the road. The problem is you've got this trade-off between, if you let the Banksias grow close to the road, it's good habitat, but it means that the honey eaters are sort of flying out when cars are flying past. So it is a difficult issue to deal with in terms of trying to minimise roadkill of some of those birds.
Thanks.
So there are challenges.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ross. It's at 8:30, but there's some really great questions here. So we might just try and do a couple more. Councillor Caress Rhodes, who's the Deputy Mayor of Liverpool Council, has asked several questions. One of them is virtual fencing was ruled out by our council because they work better in rural areas with low light. Is this true?
The only thing I can say there is that the studies that have been done that I'm aware of that have been published, one of them is a bit controversial because it wasn't properly replicated. And when I say replicated, you need to do it at multiple locations and you need basically controls. So if you get a decrease in roadkill after you put up the virtual fence, the question is, would that have just occurred anyway? Because populations of animals go up and down. So it needs to be done properly. And when it was done properly in Europe, they basically found there was no effect. I'm the editor of Australian Mammalogy, so a journal which actually published one of those virtual fence studies. There was a critique of that paper, and one of the points made by some other road ecologists was that a lot of animals habituate to things. So with something like a virtual fence that relies on sound and light, animals might be perturbed initially and avoid those areas, but over time a lot of animals will habituate, become used to those disturbances and may still cross. So it could be possible you actually see a benefit in the short term, but then over time that benefit might disappear.
Thanks. Look, we might have a question for for Jackie now. Gary has asked, Jackie, was your group part of consultation in designing the passes and passing on local knowledge?
Yes, we were. We actually were monitoring all of the roadkill, and we knew the areas where we would be more likely to get some. As I said, on some sections of Wacos Parkway, it was nothing to have 5 wallabies killed in a small section, particularly after rain, which is something interesting because Russ and I were talking about this the other day. Monable Road was not unusual to have 2 or 3 wallabies killed in one small section. We knew exactly where we needed to fence, but as I said, it was also dictated by where there was underpasses and whether there were cliff edges, because we obviously used cliff edges as part of a way of reducing the cost of the fencing. So the problem depends on the topology of the land as well if you're trying to keep costs down. So, but you can pick out where you are likely to need your fencing usually. There's probably, if people keep really regular records and have a look, they'll probably find there are certain areas that really desperately need fencing over others.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Look, we might make this the last question, but please be aware that if we don't get to your question, then we'll follow up with an email to answer it afterwards. And also that we can stay on the line after we finish here just to, if people have additional questions. So the last question, again from Councillor Rhodes, koalas follow a dense planting of feeder trees to direct them through a safer route? Jackie or Ross, would you like to answer that?
And I'll pass to Ross because he's the expert there.
Possibly. I mean, the answer is probably yes, because up in my area, there's a lot of areas where there are macadamia plantations that have tallow woods planted as fence line trees, and the koalas, there's often a lot of koalas in those fence line areas. And I can also say that groups like the Friends of the Koala in Lismore that have their own planting, so they have access to foliage that they can feed animals in care, they often have a problem that they're getting koalas moving into some of those areas where they've planted the trees that they're trying to use as sources of foliage for the animals in care. So koalas will target the preferred feed trees when they are planted. So that may be one way of trying to direct them. And certainly it is an issue that people often say, where there are roads or whatever, they try and avoid people from planting primary food trees close to roads because of that concern that they can occupy them. But there's certainly lots of areas around the northern rivers where the koalas are actually in roadside trees, and it creates a bit of a problem with roadkill. But yeah, you could probably turn that to your advantage.
It's a good question.
Thank you so much. As I said earlier, we'll try to get back to people regarding all of the questions that haven't been answered. And I'd like to finish by thanking Ross and Jackie so much for their time. It's just been so informative and inspirational. And we've really, I really appreciate your time today. We've had about 60 participants. And so there's obviously a lot of interest in this topic. So thank you both, Ross and Jackie. If you'd like to find out more about SSEC's work on wildlife crossings, you can go to the links which are being posted in the chat as I speak, I believe. And you can learn more about the SSEC campaign on wildlife crossings. You can also learn about future events at the Sutherland Shire Environment Centre by signing up to our mailing list on the website. And this Zoom presentation has been recorded, and we'll send an email to everyone with a link to the recording so you can watch it again. So I'd just like to thank you all very much for attending and wish you a fabulous evening.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you so much, Ross.
Yeah,
and
thank
everyone
you very
for coming
much.
along. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. So feel free to leave, get on with your evening. Or feel free to stay on the line if you'd like to keep chatting.
I guess we could answer a few more questions if people were wanting to hang on. Okay.
Yeah.
Kay, can we put it to a gallery view? I think people have dropped off now, and I'm just wondering if we can sort of see everybody. Maybe they can just pop up their hands.
Yeah. So Georgia has her.
I don't know how this works because I'm not in a gallery view. Do I have to put my hand up for my microphone to go on? I just wondered if I might make that announcement that I posted in the chat, a GoFundMe page for Maria Mathis, whose house was uninsured and flooded. And she had a second round of floodwater coming down from Lismore when we went up to see her last week, while she monitored the koalas in the trees at Baggetville and, kept her koala equipment dry. So anyone who's concerned about people in the floods, there's an individual who might benefit from small donations, which can add up.
Thanks, Georgia.
Thank you.
And Bruce has had a number of questions. Bruce, you're on now.
Hello, folks. It was so wonderful to have this on, and please do this again, because the more people get on, the more knowledge we have. It was so wonderful to see the statistical. I'm a big old nerd, so I got excited when I saw statistics and data and pictures and drawings. And sorry, just my thing is, oh, yes, I've got 50 questions, but in one of them was about the F6. Have all of you, and I do want all of you to approach, have you approached the F6 stage 1 in regards to the F6 stage 2, which is the rest of the F6? Because when I went to an information session they had just about a week ago over at Cogra, when I mentioned having 99.9% of the F6 underground and then having an environmental offset corridor, green corridor directly above, they got super excited about that. And they seem to do what is requested by local people and the local council. So for instance, they spent a few $1 million putting in those god-awful AstroTurf parks for Rockdale Council, because Rockdale Council asked for those. So I don't know if you guys have looked at everyone banding together, teaming up and saying, right, yes, we want the F6, but we want 100% of it underground, except for the on-ramps, off-ramps. And yes, we'd like these, because then what that would do is that would actually address your whole need for the crossings, because the whole road will be underground.
Yeah, it's a great question, Bruce. Thank you. Would Jackie or Ross like to speak to that?
I don't know anything about the F6. I'm sorry, I'm a bit insular on the north side of Sydney and mainly the Pacific Highway. So, Ross?
Oh, I'm not that familiar with it, because I'm not sort of spending much time in that area. So I think we'll have to flick it back to you, Kay and Catherine.
Yeah.
I think that that's something we're going to have to be considering. I mean, it would be terrific if that happened, but from what I can tell, the planning stages of that are still so far off. They've delayed the move through the Royal National Park for years now, and you know, from what I understand, it's not predicted to happen for at least another 10 years the way they're going. But
I will make one comment there, Catherine. We found with Monable Road, we needed to get in early, and you really need to be in from day one saying, this is what we want, this is what we want. Because otherwise, I mean, we went through 7 project managers for Monable Road upgrade, and every time we got a new manager, we had to go back to square one and tell them what we were wanting. And they didn't seem to have any internal communication. And I don't mean that negatively. I just think a new person comes into the job and basically they're given their head and allowed to run. So unless there's someone hammering on the door saying we want X, Y, or Z, it won't happen. You need to be there from day one. So you need to be doing it now.
no, that's really good to consider. That's really,
Brett Ryan had a question that was in the he put in the Q&A, and I noticed Brett is still here, and it was Jackie, how can we have Koala return to the Northern Beaches, Cottage Point, relocating program?
Yeah, well, your problem with Cottage Point is that you've got a road that goes right through the national park that is not locked off at night. I've thought about this a lot, because we do definitely have koalas have been seen up around Cottage Point, and we did actually have a huge koala population at Avalon. And in 1990, I think, Smith and Smith, who were two very important ecologists, said, if you don't do something, you're going to lose that population. Well, guess what? We lost the whole population. So the real problem is, unless you can control cars, I don't think you've got much hope of having a koala population in Ku-ring-gai National Park. I know they shut off West Head at night. They have somebody who comes theoretically on dusk and opens it up theoretically on dawn, although they're frequently late. And we've found multiple eastern pygmy possums squashed on that road where they've been late in closing off the public from driving up and down the road after dark. Cottage Point is an interesting problem because it's a centre where people live and they need to have access after hours. But I don't know how you fix the problem. I've thought about it a lot. All I can think of is perhaps putting a fence across and blocking off a bit like we have with Mulligan's Flat blocking off the whole of West Head and moving all of the koalas into there so that we then at least have an area where they can breed without becoming roadkill.
So we might make this the last one then. Andrew Douglas has a question. What was your question, Andrew?
Hi, Kay, Jackie, Catherine and Ross. I'm really appreciative of everything that you've done tonight. One of the things that drives me a bit bonkers, I've had 30 years working as a traffic engineer on Gympie bypasses and major road projects. A lot of what we did for wildlife movement in the 90s, we did by stealth. So the Department of Main Roads didn't even know we were doing it, and two of our early underpasses ended up in a guideline document the Main Roads later produced, patting themselves on the back for not spotting what we were really up to, which is pretty sad. What I'm at is I'm getting to that stage of my career where I'm about to sell my business in the next couple of years, my main traffic engineering business. I just want to concentrate on this stuff full time because I think interest is at a level. And what I really want to understand is how can all of the disparate groups that are all screaming for essentially the same thing join forces so that when Jackie's bending over backwards to get in the ear of her local parliamentarian, it's not 500 signatures, it's 50,000 signatures, when, you know, all the other lovely people, you know, Patricia Durham, all of those are trying to have a win in their area. Because I think, and look, I know I've been in the consultation strategy meetings, I've done public consultation for the Gympie bypass, I've done all this kind of stuff. I know how the game's played from the other side. And the divide and conquer method is a very strong, valid method that project managers and that use. So how can we compensate by not allowing them to divide and conquer us, and also not allow it to be kicked down, the can kicked down the road? I came up with a couple of kick-ass underpasses under the Ipswich motorway in Brisbane. And when I left to set up my own business, I left with the understanding that that was all locked and loaded. But the value management exercise that followed not long after I left, stripped them right back to a fairly bare bones approach, and even put a bloody fence in the way of where the wildlife was meant to move. So I got really annoyed with that because we did a lot of work, but they saved themselves, you know, $2.5 million or whatever they saved, and patted themselves on the back. So it needs a champion inside those project teams, but it needs a real weight of support of everyone to maintain the external pressure, or as soon as a foot's taken off, it goes away. I suppose that's what I'm saying, is working with engineers and being one myself.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Would Jackie or Ross or Catherine, would you like to comment on that? And I just say that, you know, in terms of dividing and conquering, seeing 60 people here tonight interested, and, you know, 2 experts, shows and is an example of people coming together. But would you like to comment on that, Jackie, Ross or Catherine?
I'll comment first. I would say that you're right about business as usual, and they do try and divide and conquer. That's where really big groups are good, especially groups that have got young people coming along, because within our group, our main core group, we've had people move out of the area, and we've even had some deaths, which really knocks the group around. You do need a really big group of young people coming in behind and pushing. The other thing is, as my husband says, you just have to be politely persistent. 2 Ps. You just keep at it again and again and again. And when you get somebody who doesn't know what's happening, like we had a project manager who didn't see any point in having roadkill mitigation, we just kept going and driving from the northern beaches to Parramatta, and we regularly went and visited him, and we eventually wore him down, and he agreed, and then he got moved on to another project, and then we got a new person and we had to do the same again. But Ross might have something to add about it. I think it's persistence and being polite and just being, I'm sorry, but I'm just not accepting that.
I'm not sure about being polite, Jackie.
Well,
I'm sure you are polite, but I think maybe you get a bit more attention when you're impolite. And I don't mean you, I mean anyone that's trying to convince local members or whoever. It's an interesting point you raise, Andrew, and I think it's a challenge. And somehow all of the different community groups need to be in contact with each other somehow. And I'm not the best person to advise how to do that, but clearly there's, as you say, there's a lot of these sort of things just, replicating themselves all around the country where local groups are trying to win over and get their projects built. I guess my experience early on was where we were working in Brisbane. So Brisbane City Council was actually, I guess, a Green Council at the time, and they put in those 2 land bridges, one at Compton Road and one at Hamilton Road. And yes, there were community groups. So the Karawatha Forest Preservation Society agitated for Compton Road. So I guess, that you have to win over the local politicians to some extent. And as Jackie says, work with some of these road authorities. But yeah, it is a challenge if personnel keep changing. I guess one way is to try and work with the councils, because Lismore Council has been fairly effective in that, and this has probably come through because of the Koala receiving federal listing. So they have a number of environmental officers now that spend a lot of time on koala issues. So it's really just that koalas are so, so iconic and political and so on that, that attention is put on their needs. And now maybe with the upgrading of the koala, it might increase. But that's sort of what you're looking at. You need some species that's going to be a sort of a flagship and that people will respond to. I don't know that too many people would be responding to broad-headed snakes if we were trying to argue that we need structures for broad-headed snakes. So yeah, I guess a multitude of approaches, working with the local council, trying to work with a road agency, and maybe harassing the local members. We've seen state and fed members sort of responding with what's been happening in Lismore and other areas on the north coast in terms of the floods. So bad news stories do actually get their attention, and sometimes it makes them respond. So yeah, and I guess the koala has been useful in that regard, with lots of people saying it's going to become extinct in the next 10 or 20 years. So yeah, but clearly all the different community groups need to somehow be in contact with each other, and I'm not sure how that would be done.
Thank you. On that note, we might close there. Thank you again so much, Ross and Jackie, and thank you for all the amazing people who've stayed on until now, nearly 2 hours in. As I mentioned before, the webinar's been recorded, so you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. And please check out more on the SSCC website. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks.
Thank you to Catherine and to Kay for organising it too.
Yeah, thanks.
They've done a lot of work.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.